to have you back as we come around God's Word. And today is a little bit different. I'm not going to spend a lot of time actually reading Scripture, or rather I'm going to summarize some of the events and stories that took place. And there'll be a couple of verses there on the screen. And I encourage you to go back and look at these passages in Genesis if you want to get a fuller picture of the events that I'm talking about. From time to time, I've had an idea for a new television show. It follows around a pair of mental health experts who visit people who've been traumatized in other television shows. So think of a superhero movie, and during the one of the fights between, I don't know, Superman, Iron Man, and someone else, they wipe out an office building, because they always seem to happen in cities with lots of skyscrapers around. Okay, so they wipe out this office building, and then this pair of psychologists or counselors, trauma counselors, they come in and they sit down with the people who narrowly escaped the building before it collapsed, and they help them process what just happened and why they survived and others died. And so they talk about that and what happened and how do they, as just spectators to this big fight between the superheroes, how do they fit in, or how do they find meaning? And maybe this pair of psychologists would visit with families in another episode. Visit with the families of the many people who've been arrested on Law and Order, to sit down with them and consider what went wrong. Where did they turn to a life of crime? What was behind that? And then discuss how can the family best support that family member who's been imprisoned, and not just while he's in prison, but after he's released. And so that would be the show. Or people have been traumatized in many different ways. Perhaps they were rescued by Chicago fire from off a bridge just before they died or something. They were rescued there, but they have nightmares, recurring nightmares about that moment in time. And so the follow-up episode spends time helping them work through that. Okay, I don't think that's going to be a hit TV show anytime, but I have often wondered about these ancillary characters in the television shows or in the movies, and what life would be like for them once the cameras go away. And so while we're celebrating the success of the good guys winning and the bad guys getting what's coming for them, these two mental health superheroes would be picking up the pieces from the mayhem left behind. Okay, I feel like that's kind of where we find ourselves today. Genesis is often called, the book of Genesis covers a period of time that's often called the Patriarchal Age, at least in Bible circles. In just general history circles, it's kind of the middle of the Bronze Age, if you're keeping track of that. But usually when we talk about the patriarchs, we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They lived a long time ago. Abraham is most people sort of think, well, the events that of Abraham's life take place at about 2000 BC. So that's several centuries before the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who you may have heard of. So we have these great patriarchs described in the book of Genesis, and they become the ancestors of all Israel: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes. Now, they are so important that they get a historical era named after them. But these guys weren't just running around Canaan by themselves doing great deeds of faith and standing up for what's right and for God and God's way. They were part of a family, part of a community, because it wasn't just a nuclear family like we think of. They were fairly wealthy. They had shepherds who worked for them. They had servants. They had, large families. The servants had families. So it's a large group of people. And so what we're going to do, since there's, really it's not just about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're going to be the TV psychologists that I described in my new show. And we're going to look in and sit down with the women who were left behind in the chaotic wake of these patriarchs. We start our conversation today with the matriarch. That is, without a doubt, Sarah. Sarah was married to Abraham, lived to be almost 100 herself, and traveled up and down Canaan, traveled all the way from Ur to Canaan, and then up and down Canaan with Abraham. She was on the road a long time, and is clearly the matriarch of Israel. I suspect that her story is pretty familiar to most of us. As she was approaching the age of 100, she and Abraham didn't have any children. And yet God had promised time and again that Abraham and Sarah would be the ancestors of a great nation. He promised Abraham, he said, it's going to be like the sand on the sea, it's going to be like the stars in the sky. And that's how many descendants you're going to have. And all the time, Abraham and Sarah didn't have a single child. Now, Sarah is going to sit down today, not on our buddy bench. We're expanding it because we have actually 4 women that we're going to talk with today. So we got some different benches just for this week. But Sarah is going to sit down first of all with her granddaughter-in-law. Okay, got that? Granddaughter-in-law, Rachel. Rachel married Sarah's grandson, Jacob. So like Sarah, Rachel also had tremendous trouble having children. What was different is that, unlike Sarah, Rachel was her husband's second wife. Her father, his name was Laban, he had played this bait and switch with Jacob. He said, here is my beautiful young daughter, and if you want her, you need to marry the older daughter that is not as beautiful. In fact, he didn't even lay it out exactly like that for Jacob. He just, on the wedding day, switched the brides, covered up in their veils and everything. And Jacob didn't find out until it was too late. So a week later, Jacob married Rachel as well, after getting very upset with their father. But life was instantly more complex than either Jacob or Rachel expected. So as Sarah and Rachel are sitting at a table, they've come inside because it's cold, they're sitting at a table, they're having coffee, and they're talking, and they share the pain that accompanied their infertility. For Sarah, the promise of a nation was always hanging over her head, and she felt like such a failure. What if God's promise to Abraham came to nothing because her body didn't function the way that it was supposed to? If she was a real woman, she would have been able to have the children that Abraham needed to become the father of a great nation. And so she tells Rachel, as they're talking, that she says, when I heard some messengers from God, and they came and they were talking to Abraham, and it's a tent, the walls aren't thick, I can hear what's going on even if I'm not in the room, and they told Abraham that I was going to have a baby, and I laughed at them out loud. Like, these men just don't seem to understand how it works. I'd really given up on having children. I couldn't understand what God was talking about. Why did he keep talking about all these descendants when we couldn't have the first child? But since this was the patriarchal age, I told my patriarch to try having children with my Egyptian servant. I thought that would be close enough, right? Does it matter if it's me as long as it's from him? And I thought I'd be happy if he was happy. If he has a son, he'll be happy. If he's happy, I'll be happy. But I wasn't. It was horrible. And then I was horrible to her. Eventually, I kind of got over things. I settled down. I never really felt comfortable, but I shouldn't have given up on God. Because lo and behold, God gave me a son. And I finally felt, for the first time, maybe not the first time in a long time, I finally felt like I'd accomplished something, that I was worth something to my husband. So Rachel has been sitting at the table and nodding her head as Sarah talks, and now she speaks and she says, I know what you mean. My father messed things up for me from the beginning. He insisted that Jacob marry my sister first. She would never have got married if it wasn't for me, I don't think. Who would want to be married to her? And my dad, he doesn't have a romantic bone in his body. He just made this a business deal and he just got it done. He didn't want to care for Leah longer than he needed to. And this was his opportunity. I know that Jacob really only wanted to marry me. But when I couldn't have children, Jacob started having children with Leah. I was so desperate. At one point, I just wanted to die. I felt worthless. And then Jacob and I started fighting, which made no sense because it wasn't his fault. But I was just mad at the world, mad at God. Like you, I even gave Jacob my servant to have children. I thought it would make me feel better. I'd take the children, I'd adopt them as my own. But it didn't. And Leah just had more. Eventually, God did give me a son. His name is Joseph. Oh, such a good boy. I was so happy. I asked for more, and I had Benjamin. But then I died giving birth. And it just seemed like my death then was a punchline in a cruel joke that was my life. Yes, you can have a child, but it will kill you. And so Sarah and Rachel exchange stories and comfort each other in their grief. And then our TV experts transition and they sit down with the other women in this scenario. The first is Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant. And then they'll talk with Leah as well. But Hagar explains. She says, I'd been a loyal servant to Sarah for years and would often talked about her grief at her inability to have children. And then one day, out of the blue, she wants me to have her husband's child. I felt exploited. It wasn't really like I could say no. It suddenly felt as though I wasn't of any value. The only thing that mattered was getting Abraham a son, was starting a great nation. And sure enough, I got pregnant. I know I kind of rubbed it in Sarah's face, but she totally overreacted. She went wild. She made my life miserable. I couldn't take it anymore. I actually ran away. And I would have kept on running. I don't know where, just to get away. But God heard me. God saw me. God found me. And He promised me that my son would become a leader of a great nation himself, if only I'd go back to Abraham and Sarah. And so I did. It's hard to say no in a conversation with God. When Ishmael, my son, was about 13, Sarah finally got pregnant herself at 91 years old, if you'll believe that. A few years later, they're having a party for this kid. It was a big feast, food for everyone. And I admit I got carried away, but I was laughing at them making this big fuss over a son. Well, Sarah flipped her lid again. She saw me laughing. She was so mad. She made Abraham send me away, just gave me a water bottle and a little bit of food and sent me out into the desert. That water didn't last any time at all. It was hot. I thought we were going to die. And then God showed up again. Gave us more water. And we were able to get to safety. Things turned out all right for us in the end. But I never felt as though I meant anything to them. Once they had their own child, their own son, then my son and I just didn't matter anymore. So Leah's been listening to Hagar talk. And at this point she chimes in. She says, "I'm so sorry for you, Hagar. I relate so much to what you're saying. I wasn't a servant. In fact, I was actually Jacob's first wife. But he never really loved me. I was just like the wreath on his shiny new car named Rachel. Can you believe that he told people that I had weak eyes? He couldn't see what was going on inside his own tent. He thought my little sister hung the moon. She couldn't even give him any children. Me, on the other hand, I gave him 6 sons. My first I named, 'It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now.'" Well, not that whole phrase, but a name that carries that idea. And that was the first son. "Surely my husband will love me now." But he didn't. And the last son I named, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor." 6 sons. And he still didn't love me. Can you believe that when Rachel's servant, not even Rachel herself, when Rachel's servant had a second son, she named that son, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, but I have won." How rude is that? It's as though we both got the opposite of what we wanted. I just wanted to be loved by anyone, especially Jacob. Why couldn't he love me? Instead, I have 6 sons. Rachel, she had a husband that loved her, but then she just wanted children. And she didn't get those. And so as the camera zooms away, as the picture fades, we realize that these patriarchs had a complicated set of relationships. But at the core of each of these women's lives is a longing to be valued and appreciated. And if we ask Sarah and Rachel, what makes you valuable? I think they'd say having children will make me valuable. Having children, perpetuating our family line, giving God His great nation, that is what will make us significant, will make us loved, will make us special. And if we were to turn to Hagar and Leah on the other bench, and if we were to ask them the same question, I think they'd respond something like, I just want to be loved and valued. Like, children are great and I love my kids and I'm so glad I have them, but I just want intimacy and love from someone close to me. I want to have value on my own, not just for the children I can have. And so 4,000 years later, the search for significance is still important for all of us. None of us wants to feel insignificant, unvalued, like we have no purpose for being here. And so what is it that makes you feel valued? Is it the person you're married to, or just the fact that you're married? Is it that you're a parent and that's your purpose, your significance, or a grandparent? Is it that you perform well at your job, and so you that gives your life meaning each day, to get up and go and perform well on the job? Is it your educational achievements, that you've accomplished something and you've got the certificate to prove it? Is it the friends that you have? So we can, on the one hand, we can take pride or find purpose in these things. But on the other hand, the absence of those things from our lives can also create an emptiness. Because we can say, well, I haven't accomplished that. I may have accomplished 4 of them, but I haven't accomplished the 5th one, and I just feel like I don't have any purpose, I don't have any meaning. I don't have a significance or make a contribution that anyone values. And so we're left questioning our place in the world. And so we need to give a great deal of thought as to where our purpose, our significance, our value is located. Because a lot of the things that I've listed that we may find our value in, find our purpose in, can be taken away from us. And where does that leave us? So I'm not going to invalidate the importance of these accomplishments. Okay, I'm not going to invalidate and say, oh, you know, if you're struggling with infertility, well, hey, you know, people still love you. No, that's a very deep ache that people experience. The desire to be loved is a very deep ache, and I'm not going to tell you just to get over it. Okay, the pride, the justified pride that comes with performing well on the job or accomplishing something in education, like they are worthy, and they become part of who we are because we've invested so much of our life in those things. And so they're important in their own right. But I want you to leave today, I want you to tune out today, knowing that in God's eyes, each and every person starts off life and continues throughout life as significant. Jesus came to this earth not just because he loved the world in general, right? He does love the world in general, but he also loves us individually, and he died for us individually. In Romans chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, we're reminded that Jesus died for all of us, whether we love him or not, whether we please him or not. He loved us enough to die for us, to rescue us. He didn't wait for us to get our lives together. In fact, he said, while we were still enemies of his. Sure, he says, like think of it in terms of Jacob, like Jacob and Rachel, right? Jacob worked 17 years for his father-in-law, 14 years for his father-in-law in order to marry Rachel. It was like, yes, she is worth that for me. And so you sort of see what Paul is saying here in Romans. He says, perhaps for a good person, a righteous person, someone might, consider dying. Like, I'll take the risk to rescue you because you're such a good person. I'll work for 14 years because, you're such a beautiful woman. And so you can sort of understand that. And yet, at the same time, when it comes to our relationship with God, there's nothing we can do to impress him. That he says, yeah, look at you. You're so good. Oh, I need to save you. I'm going to come down to earth, become human, die on a cross because you're good. Rather, he says, I created you. I love you. You are special to me. And I'm going to rescue you because you need to be rescued from sin and the effects of sin. And so Jesus came and died for us while we were still sinners. Jesus makes each of us significant and valuable. And the rest of life, the rest of things that get added onto it, they're icing on our cake. And the icing can be pretty good, right? The frosting, it can be pretty good. But it needs to go on a cake. And Jesus is what gives us our purpose and our significance. You are loved. Go into the week knowing that you're significant, that you're valuable, that Jesus died for you because he loves you.